Hi, I'm happy to welcome you on our online recording, the EB-5 Visa Update 2024-25. In this short video, we will go through the main trends and changes which happened with the EB-5 program in 2024. We will go through the number of new petitions filed, reviewed petitions, we'll discuss the processing time, retrogression, and what the main news happened with the program in the last year, and we'll try to predict what's going to happen with the program in the nearest future. My name is Varvara. I'm a third-party promoter working outside the US with EB-5 program for more than 7 years. On this channel, we talk about EB-5 program, a US investment immigration program. So if you like this topic, don't forget to subscribe. And today we have a special guest, Ahmed Khan, who is the Vice President of the Regional Center EB-5 Affiliated Network. Ahmed, thanks a lot that you found the time to join us today.
Thank you so much for having me. It's my pleasure to be here.
Ahmed, I think it would be good for a start if you can share a few words about your experience in EB-5 before we jump to the presentation.
Sure. So, as Varvara mentioned, my name is Ahmed Khan. I have worn a lot of different hats over the years in EB-5, but I've been in the industry for about 12 years now. I started my career as an immigration attorney at some of the biggest firms in the EB-5 space, including Classico Immigration Law Partners, Fragaman, some others as well. And I've also been a regional center executive now for over 5 years at two of the top regional centers in the US. So I've got a lot of experience both on the investor side, doing source of funds and filing applications and things like that on behalf of regional centers. But I've also got a lot of experience on now the project structuring side, working for regional centers for so long.
Thank you. So I'm sure you had this conversation with investors not once, where you have to, in very brief sentence, explain what the EB-5 program is. So before we move into the trends and news, it would be good to give a general idea what the EB-5 is. So please do so.
Yeah, of course. So, EB-5 at its heart is an investment-based visa. So those people who are either in the US or overseas and have thought about basically getting a green card in the US and the employment path is not working, the family path is not working. If they have the funds, they can bypass all that by making either an $800,000 or $1,050,000 investment into a project that will create 10 jobs, and they will be able to get a green card. It sounds fairly simple, but obviously the difficult part is coming up with the money. And not only do you have to have the money, but you have to be able to show that the money was obtained from a lawful source. Obviously, you have to meet the other admissibility requirements, meaning that you are able to become a permanent resident of the United States. But at its core, this program has been around since 1990 to allow people to basically invest into projects that are either businesses or development projects to create jobs in the US economy. And as a result, the US government grants them a US green card or permanent residency.
Thanks. And if we talk about 2024, one of the big changes which happened is increase in the governmental fees. So what are your thoughts in regards of the increase, and have you seen a spike of the number of applications from investors during this time?
Yeah, and I think that this trend kind of followed what we've seen in the past with EB-5, right? There was a huge spike as people tried to avoid the higher application fees, and rightfully so. I think that a lot of these numbers are kind of jarring when you look at them for the first time. And regional centers were no different, right? We were not immune to it either. So you can see here that just the application fee for the 526E, it's almost tripled. The 829 almost tripled, and then the 956 is almost tripled as well. And that was already 17,000. Now we're nearing the $50,000 number. So there was definitely in March when people knew that the amount was going to go up on April 1st, a big increase in interest to get the applications in. We saw a pretty big dip afterwards once the amounts did go up. But as with anything, it became kind of the new normal. And after the summer into where we are now, we've definitely seen the increase again in petitions and interest in the program, and people are kind of back to the numbers that they were, I guess, before March and things like that. Same thing with the 956. The 956, if people don't know, is basically what the regional center is filing for the establishment of a regional center or also for the establishment of a project. And anytime you make an amendment or have to do something like that, you have to pay this fee. So you saw a lot of regional centers pay a lot of money before April 1st to, if they have a project in the pipeline, get that application in and make sure that it's already filed at the lower amount. If they've got an amendment that needs to be made, they wanted to go ahead and get that filing in before the amount went up. So the volume in March, and we've seen kind of some of the stats since then, I'm sure we'll talk about it today, of the filings. There was a huge spike in March. It's normalized since then, but demand has definitely continued to stay strong. It's not like everyone filed in March and then no one was left. There's still people who are very, very interested in moving forward.
I actually heard about this up spike in the number of requests, but I was I saw that there's such a relatively small increase for the investor who is investing $800,000 for the EB-5 green card plus additional expenses of $150,000 to $200,000. This change would not be so dramatic, so it would not change their plans significantly. But as you said, that's what happened. On this slide, we can actually see that before the increase, was a huge number of applications, and after that, the number in the next quarter went back. And the quarter four, in this slide, we can see the number of new investors who filed their application per each quarter. And I was waiting for the numbers for the last quarter 4, 2024, to see if they're actually the number going up or not. And I got them just before the recording, like 10 minutes before.
Yep.
I was able to put
Right.
them.
They just got released yesterday. Yep, exactly. So I think this is very. I mean, if you look at last year, and really since the RIA, kind of first really gained steam, you saw steady demand and then the huge spike in Q2 of this year. And I think that what that really was, to your point, every dollar does matter, obviously, and I think that there's a common misconception that EB-5 investors are multimillionaires who just have 800,000 or 1,050,000 lying around, and they can pay the administrative fees with no questions and things like that. But the reality is that a lot of people are basically putting together their life savings and then making the investment with that. So every dollar does count. And I think what it really did was there was a lot of people who were on the fence by Q2. They had started to hear about it, they had started to learn about it, and this helped get them over the fence. Basically, they said, okay, you know what? This is a driving factor. Let me save $7,000 if I can. I agree with you. It's kind of silly when you're spending, anywhere from $900 to $1 million on an investment to worry about 7,000. But to my point, every little bit does matter. And
but it's great to see that demand for EB-5 is actually going up.
Yeah, absolutely. I think really what this is it's showing that EB-5 is kind of back. It's back to pre-pandemic levels. And that was really the benchmark that we were trying to get to. It's tough to imagine a world where we go back to the 2012 and 2013 days when, China was filing, anywhere from 10,000 applications a year. But it's good to see it kind of go back to the normalized numbers of 2017 to 2019 when the world was getting involved and everyone was filing a very, healthy amount of applications from each part of the world. And I think that's how EB-5 was always intended. It's supposed to be a pathway for people from all over the world to really take advantage of this program. And it just means that the word is getting out. More people are learning about the program. More people are seeing it as an option. More people are using it as a solution for their families, which is great.
Yeah. On this slide, we can see what's happening with USCIS with number of reviewed applications. And it's important for us to see what's happening there because it has a direct influence on the processing time for the EB-5. In 2022, there were more than 13,000 applications pending, and we see that the USCIS have done a great job on going through these applications and reviewing them in the last few quarters. And it's good to see that the last 3 quarters, the number of adjudicated petitions is above 3,000.
Yeah, this is probably the most encouraging statistic, right? Because the biggest problem in EB-5 over the last, we'll say decade has been that USCIS has been very slow in processing, and then you have to wait at the consulate. And when you're spending this much money as an investor, the worst thing that can happen is that the government is just slow to give you the benefit that you've not bought, but certainly invested into. And so I think that seeing these numbers and seeing the amount of people over the last year that have started to see actual progress and get some of their permanent residencies and getting some of their permanent green cards after the IA-29 adjudication and really clearing out the backlog, except for China, for all the other countries. I mean, if you look at the visa bulletin, even India now has reached January of 2022, which is just before the RIA was released. So they're very close to being current up to the RIA. So it's very heartening and I think very positive to see USCIS moving in the right direction, adjudicating a lot of these petitions and doing what they're supposed to, essentially just doing their job. Because for a while there, as you can see in 2022, they weren't. They weren't doing very much.
Absolutely agree here. And if we're looking at the processing times, which I mentioned, There is official USCIS web page, which has information in regards of I-526 legacy forms. And here on this slide, we can see that processing time for these petitions is outrageous. It's 58 months for non-Chinese investors and more than 90 months for investors from China. But this processing time is related to the people who filed their petition before March 2022. For them, what they came through, it was the COVID, the technical stop of the program, some changes in the program back and forward. So they actually were the most unlucky ones, if you would say so. But there is no official information from USCIS on what the processing time now for the other petitions. And this is why Invest in USA, the Association of Regional Centers in the US, have done their own study. And I think your regional center took part in it, right?
Yes, we did.
And they reviewed the information available in 8 regional centers to come up with processing time, which they see on practice for petitions, because this information is crucial for any investors who's starting their EB-5 journey. They all want to know how long it's going to take, and it's obvious, right? So from the last data we have, the rural projects are processed in the I-5 to 6 petitions for rural projects are processed anywhere between 6 to 15 months, and for high unemployment projects anywhere between 11 and 16 months. Ahmed, what's happening in your regional center and what you hear from investors? Is that something close to real?
It's close, but there's a lot of variables here that even IIUSA admitted to when they published these results. And the biggest one is that they only used approvals. So they're only counting data from approved applications. So really what, I think high unemployment is a good example here. They're saying that, somewhere between 11 to 16 months for high unemployment, but there's such a small number of those approvals. I think there's less than 3% total approval that have already been filed. And a lot of the ones that are pending are actually longer than the 16-month period. You're
Yeah,
looking
we
at closer.
filed in 2022 and they're still waiting. It's more
They're
than
still waiting, exactly. And we're seeing the same thing in our regional center where, we have rural. So, without getting too deep into the actual numbers, we're well over 700 applications since the RIA. On the rural side, almost a third, we're getting close to almost a half already approved. And we've seen those approvals at an average of about 9 to 12 months. So we fall directly into this timeline that IIUSA has shared. And we thought that this number was pretty accurate. We have seen in the industry, and we've had a few investors that did get approved in as early as 6 months. I think those are outliers, to be honest. I think if you're an investor today investing in rural, you should keep an expectation of 9 to 12 months and always be a little bit conservative. But we will have also outliers in the other direction. We've had some people who are even a little bit longer and up to 14, 15 months to get their approvals. I do think USCIS will get faster. So far it's been a little bit slow. They've given so much priority to rural. And the reality was they just don't have enough adjudicators, right? They were doing such a good job we just looked at the slide of people who were adjudicating legacy 526s and getting those caught up. They didn't have the manpower to just spread them all over the new RIA, post RIA filings. And so they gave priority, like they were supposed to, it's written into the law, to rural applications. And we saw a big proportion of them start to move forward. This year, we're actually expecting a little bit more normalization and high unemployment to get a little bit faster. Why? Because they essentially caught up. If you look at the number of applications pending from all countries in the legacy category, there's still a lot of Chinese applications that are pending and are going to be pending for a while. And I'll get to that in a second. But a lot of other countries have now caught up, essentially all of them except for India. And India's pretty close as well. This means they can now move some of that manpower over to post RIA filings. And I think that high unemployment projects have outpaced rural pretty heavily, that they're going to be given some level of attention because they need it. These applications have been pending now for a while. People have started to file writ of mandamus filings against the government, suing the government to force them to have a response. And if enough people do that, the government starts to lose money because they have to fight those cases. And sure enough, we'll see movement there as well. So these numbers are a good baseline. And I think that what they really tell you is a little bit of a trend, more so than a number that you need to base your expectation on. What I tell people is, look, if your priority is to, let's say you're overseas and you want to get to the US as quickly as possible, rural should continue to be the option that's going to prioritize that part first. If you're okay with a slightly longer wait, and we're not talking about a huge wait difference, we're talking about maybe a year and a half at most. and maybe there's a lot more options on the high unemployment side in terms of projects and variety and returns and term of the loans and things like that. Then if you want that balance, high unemployment is still a great option. And with concurrent filing, if you're in the US, both of these are options depending on what project you like overall. One thing I'll say about the legacy stuff, right? So 80% of cases is kind of the metric that they're using for how long it's taking, right? And we're gonna get a little bit nerdy here to talk about why this is the case. USCIS did change its policy a few years ago and how they're going to process cases, and they stopped basically processing cases that were not going to be current anytime soon. And this was actually, on its face, it seems like USCIS is being lazy, but this was actually a huge, huge, huge thing for investors who had filed a long time ago and whose kids were starting to get close to aging out. Because while your 526 or 526E is pending, your kid's age does not move. It's frozen. And so 80% of cases actually are typically, obviously in China, it's all China, but for all other areas, 80% of cases are largely going to be from countries that have historically had a lot of filings like India and Vietnam and Brazil. And again, a lot of them are backlogged, especially from India. They want a slightly longer processing time until the visa bulletin shows them as current. Then they would be moving forward. I think the real thing I want to take away from that slide is that everything is trending in the right direction. After years of it being painful, both from an investor side, but even from a regional center or immigration attorney side, we're sitting on these cases for like 6, 7 years. It's painful for everybody. Nobody wants that. And so to see this progress, to see the times come down, to see basically people start to get their green cards within the same year that they're filing in some cases has been really, really encouraging from our side.
There is still a lot of space for improvement, as the
Always.
legislation of 2022 actually promised us processing time of 240, 120 days, as we have here on this slide. So we hope that by the end of next year, or maybe like in 2 years' time, they would be able to reach actually this processing time, if nothing crazy would happen, and if they will continue to work with the same efficiency as they do now. So here, actually, I wanted to check with you what you see is happening on the different type of projects which are on the market. So we have the standard, which is outside of TA and not infrastructure project. We have the TA rural, high unemployment, and infrastructure project. We have set-aside visas, which do have an influence for people who are based in China, India. The set-aside and priority processing, as you mentioned before. What you see on the markets, what kind of projects are getting prioritized by regional centers and by investors as well, and what are the main reasons why?
Yeah, it's been a little bit of a kind of seesaw of sorts over the last year and a half since the RIA really picked up steam. I think that when the RIA was first passed, the projects that got grandfathered in that were most readily available were definitely TEA high unemployment projects. A lot of projects that basically were a little bit more conservative in their calculation under the old rules still basically qualified for the high unemployment category under the new rules. And so a lot of projects and a lot of applications went into the high unemployment. And you see that if you look at kind of 2023 filings, it's dramatically in favor of high unemployment projects versus rural. But people, regional center operators and investors started seeing kind of some of the benefits of rural. We definitely started seeing very fast approvals, and that was one of the big drivers for investors. And then regional centers kind of figured out that, okay, there's two big chunks of the market. It's always going to be China and India. Their populations are reflective of that, as countries. And a lot of other people are still filing, but you're going to get also a big chunk of your filings from there, plus the speed factor. And so they started prioritizing finding rural projects. I will say I still haven't seen a huge number of rural projects on the market, while there are a ton of high unemployment projects that come out pretty much every week. And sometimes being in the industry, we see some of the smaller deals that maybe a lot of investors are not getting to, and during their research, they're sticking with the big names and the big regional centers. But there's a lot of high unemployment projects out there. There's maybe a few handfuls of rural projects, but we've seen that the deals look very different from one another. So I think the trend right now, and certainly it seems like based on the data that we've seen over the last couple of days, that a lot more people are starting to file in rural over the last year. It's still outpaced. I mean, high unemployment is still outpaced rural by over 1,000 filings, based on the latest data set that we've got from USCIS. We're well over 4,000 filings now for high unemployment. We're still somewhere in the low 3,000s for rural. But I think that those numbers are gonna get much, much closer together over the next year. In fact, I would think that if it continues as it is, rural will ultimately outpace high unemployment in terms of total number of filings in the year and also total number pending. And that leads to a lot of more interesting questions, right? Because
And that was that's where I was going to go
yep, yep. So I'll let you lead us into it, and then I'll talk a little bit about what I think that we're going to see.
Yeah, but here the main point why rural are kind of becoming more and more popular, especially for investors from India and China, is retrogression, because that's what they're afraid of, and that's why they would prefer the rural project to high unemployment. Because if you are not from India and China, the difference for you is not so huge actually. But if you're from
Correct.
one of these two countries, then that's a big question for you. So what are your thoughts on the retrogression for Indian and Chinese investors in the upcoming 2025? Because they updated the last visa bulletin with the information that they foresee that in the next year, there is a high chance that the retrogression would happen for China or India. But what are your thoughts?
Yeah, and I think it's really important to understand that on a long-term kind of outlook, nothing has changed, right? 4,000 people already filed in high unemployment. Guess what? If you whether you found out about it or not from the visa bulletin, those people were still pending. So the long-term outlook really hasn't changed. I do think that we've known for some time now that high unemployment was headed towards a backlog for Chinese and Indian investors. The way that the Department of State has kind of explained visa allocation and essentially the waterfall structure and how they look at things, if you're not from one of those two countries, chances are you'll almost never be retrogressed in EB-5 because of the amount of visas that are available basically to each country across all categories. That you get a little bit of protection. China and India are retrogressed in every category, whether it's EB-5, EB-2, EB-1, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that's one of the main takeaways is if you're not from China or India, and we're not talking about passport, we're talking about where you were born, right? If you're Indian passport holder born in Canada, guess what? You're actually Canadian in terms of US chargeability. And that's a really important, I think, factoid to have in mind when you're doing this. But yeah, the main thing here really is that we've seen these backlogs already develop. The math is fairly simple. If there's 4,000 applications and conservatively 2 people per application, historically it's actually closer to 3, but we'll say 2 just to make it, the best case scenario. That's 8,000 people that need to be given visas. And guess what? High unemployment only has protection for 1,000 people per year. And a majority of those people are going to be Chinese and Indian. And so if you're from one of those two nationalities, you know that there's a backlog coming. I think the question that no one really knows the answer to, including myself, we can all take guesses. We can all try to do the math and try to do some data evaluation and come up with a guess, is that it's only going to be, it could be 3 to 4 to 5 years of delay. We don't know how long that backlog is going to be, but it's 100% coming. And the visa bulletin just really confirmed that. My best guess for rural, we're looking at maybe a 1 to worst case scenario 2 years of backlog. But if rural backlogs for 2 years, then that's really bad for high unemployment. And this is for China and India, I should clarify, because that would mean for high unemployment, if rural is backlogged 2 years and the math is kind of going in that direction, then high unemployment, if you're from India or China, you could be backlogged somewhere between 5 to maybe even up to 8 years. And that's a pretty long backlog. If you think back to 2018, or it was 2019, that India backlog, it was a 5-year backlog. And it essentially, in a lot of ways, completely slowed the Indian market. You back to 2014 when China was first getting backlogged, and it essentially it was like a 10-year backlog at that time. So these are big numbers. There's a lot of variables here, and that's kind of what the asterisk I'll put on all this is. As they start to clear the unreserved category, those visa numbers come back to the reserved categories. That's one of the forms of relief that you're going to get. And this is, I think, a big driver now for rural, right? Not only does rural have less applications, but it also has more room. It has 2,000 visas available per year. And in the first year, it'll actually be closer to double that. And so that first like 6,000 visas that need to be issued, it's going to happen in the first 2 years. We're already kind of in that. So there's a lot of variables here, and I never want to sound like a doomsday person because it's just, in my experience, there's always, it never ends up being as bad as you think, but it also never ends up being as good as you hope for. It's always somewhere in the middle. So if my best guess is that rural is likely going to backlog about a year for most people who are filing, the next few months. It could get worse as more and more people file. For high unemployment, I think we're already at somewhere around 4 to 5 year delay. It could get worse as well as more and more people file. And again, this is specifically for Chinese and Indian nationals.
So if you are from China and India, now if you're going to file in 2025, for people who are going through adjustment of status and filing in the US, you better do it as soon as it's possible before
Yep.
the situation changes.
That's for sure, right? That we know for sure that if you're looking to adjust your status, whether it's rural or high unemployment from within the US, now is the time to move forward. Now is the time to get your application in, because one of the things that is a really big advantage is if you file your adjustment of status and get your EAD, the work permit, or the advanced parole, which is the travel permit, and then your category backlogs later, you're okay, right? Just because your application went in while you were still current, now it could take, let's say, 5, 6 years to get your conditional green card. During that time period, your family can still work and live and travel and do everything else that you would normally do with a green card. EAD and advanced parole together are a very powerful tool. It's essentially giving you the same benefits that a green card does before you get the green card. So I agree with that. You know, if you're in the US and you're looking to adjust status, no time like the present. If you're, not from China or India, this doesn't really affect you that much. But I think, it's always important to understand trends and why people are going there. And I think that this will motivate regional centers as well to hopefully find better and better projects in the rural space, because I think you and I have talked about this. We haven't seen a bunch of amazing deals that blow people's socks off in the rural space.
But it's hard to do as well, you have to admit it, because of the definition of the rural area.
Exactly. If you look at the map for what's rural in the US, almost nothing qualifies that has development going on in it. And that's why you've seen a lot of these mountain area resort style developments, because quite frankly, there just isn't very much else available.
To sum up, if you are Indian or Chinese, if you're in US and you're going to apply for change of status, then you should do it as soon as it's possible. And for you, it's not really matter what type of project you choose, rural or high unemployment, because anyway, you will get your green card later, or earlier or later, but you reserve your spot with filing and applying
Right.
for
You're securing your future. And I think the best way to describe it, especially for Indians, is if you're in the EB-2, EB-3 line, it's going to take a lifetime for you to get out of that, to get your green card. So you're doing EB-5 to beat that, right? Now, obviously, if it was 2 years faster, if it was 60 years on EB-2 and 58 years to EB-5, maybe not worth it. But it's a big difference, right? We're talking about 50 years in EB-2 and maybe just, we're talking about what, 5, 6, 7 years in EB-5. That's still remarkably better. So to Rivara's point, and I agree 100%, there's no time like the present. Get that application and get your EAD and advanced parole, have the freedom to work and live and do anything else that you want to do in the US. And yeah, it might take a little bit longer if you're in a high unemployment project, but you've still secured your family's future and you've locked in your child's age. If you're in the US and you're filing an adjustment of status, the kind of accepted rule right now is that if you get the filing in, you get the adjustment of status in, you've now locked your child's age in forever. So that's also a pretty big benefit.
Okay, let's move on. That's a complicated one, as we mentioned before. I think for this one, we will just give a summary of what happened last year, and we would not go into much details because we are limited in time. So what is sustainment period in few words?
Yeah, sustainment period is how long your money has to stay with the project. Has to, right? And before the RIA, or basically just stay invested, I guess is the better way to put it. Before the RIA, the way that this worked is that your money had to stay invested until you got your green card, and then held it for 2 years, and then filed your IA-29. So basically, when you completed those 2 years with your conditional green card, only then could you get the money back. Now you can see why this would be a problem if processing was taking 5 years for you to get your conditional green card. It created almost 7, 8, sometimes even longer timeline, especially if you were Chinese, to get your money back. Projects would often finish, and then your money would have to be reinvested or redeployed to meet the standard. So post DRA, the rule kind of basically just said 2 years, and it's the interpretation of that rule that has now been kind of up for debate. USCIS released some guidance saying that they were going to look at that and say 2 years flat. If your money goes into a project for 2 years, you can now get the money back, regardless of where you are in your immigration process. As long as it's spent and used by the JCE and all that, we can get into all that, but 2 years in the project, developer uses it, you've now met the requirements, you can get the money back. IIUSA rightfully, kind of questioned the way that this rule was interpreted and said that, USCIS can't just go around making up rules, and they sued on this point. Now, the unfortunate part of this lawsuit is if they win, the rule reverts back to the pre-RIA kind of definition. If they win, it's 50-50 in my eyes. Being an attorney myself, having read through the statute, I don't think USCIS was kind of just outside of its bounds in their interpretation based on the language of the law. And so I don't know that IIUSA is going to win their lawsuit, but if they did, and it does get reinterpreted, it's going to be a very interesting space because now there's going to be a lot of people who invested in shorter term projects, but may not have their green cards, especially as the backlogs are coming up, and that will have ramifications there. The secondary protection that IIUSA is hoping for is to institute a 5-year conditional sustainment period, just flat, and so your money will only have to be held for 5 years, and no matter which project you go into. But that would require a change in law, change in language, and it took us like 30 years to get to the RIA. So how hopeful am I of that happening? I wouldn't say I'm optimistic.
So for investors, from what you said, what really important is how they should look at the investment term of the projects, because there are projects which market 3-year investment term, there are projects which are marketing like 5-year investment term. So if the rules are back to what it used to be, what's going to happen with investors who invested in the project with 3-year investment term?
Yeah, they're going to have to be redeployed, and that's kind of the pain of it is if the rule changes back, and this uncertainty is what really gives the EB-5 a bad name. Now those investors had kind of the expectation that they were going to go in, they're going to get the short-term project. Maybe they did take longer to get their green card, but they were okay with that because their opportunity cost on their money was much lower. And now, 1.5 or 2 years after they invested, it's almost time for them to get their money back. And lawsuit wins, and suddenly the rule changes, and now their money has to be redeployed for another 2, 3, 4 years. And so, yeah, it's not really fair. And it's hard for investors to assess this risk because, to be frank, no one really knows which way the court will rule in this favor. We're not in the judge's mind, so even the best lawyers and people in this space, they can't tell you what's going to happen. And so we're all just kind of waiting for some certainty so that we can put together projects. As a regional center, we're trying to give investors the best deal we can, but we can't do that if we don't even know what the rules are to give them their money back. And so it's been a lot of uncertainty.
So being conservative, you probably would look for the project which has investment term of 4 to 5 years if you're filing now.
That's right. Yeah, I think if you're if you're Indian or Chinese, you pretty much have to look to a rural higher period if you want certainty. If you're not Indian or Chinese, I agree. I think somewhere in that 4 to 5 year timeline, regardless of high unemployment or rural, would be the sweet spot to basically get your money back without having to worry about redeployment.
Okay, now we're moving to more positive news in EB-5, which happened in 2024. The number of issued visas was the highest in the history of EB-5. And there, here on the screen, we see that more than 12,000 visas were issued. And this number does not include the petitions for adjustment of status, which were filed in the US. And this data we're going to get somewhere in March, I assume.
Yeah, it's not great. That data you can actually extrapolate. There's not a lot of approvals in on the adjustment of status side. Not a ton. There are, but there's not a bunch. But this data is incredibly optimistic, right? I mean, for them to grant 12,000 unreserved EB-5 visas is really, really high number and really, really encouraging. So this is, I think this is a really, really great number to look at.
Yeah, here again, as we discussed, what the positive things which are happening is increased efficiency of USCIS unit, which works with investors' petitions. We see that the number of petitions they reviewed is amazingly high, and we see that US consulates abroad are working very efficiently as well. But of course, the majority of visas were issued to the people who've been waiting quite for a while, and it's China, Vietnam, and India.
Yeah, so it's nice to see. I mean, Vietnam has been very, very slow since the RIA. Their economy has a bunch of other challenges. So it's nice to see. And one of the challenges was that there weren't a lot of people who had already filed who had their green cards. They were still waiting. And so, word of mouth gets around, oh, I applied in 2016, 2017, haven't got my green card yet. That's not very encouraging. So it's nice to see those people get their green cards finally, because I think that will promote positive word of mouth and start to move things forward. So I think all that's really good. These numbers are not surprising by any stretch. I think that next year we're going to see a very similar kind of story. Vietnam will go down. I think India should go up. as they catch up to theirs. The rest of the countries should stay pretty constant. So yeah, it's encouraging to see this stuff, to be honest.
Yeah, I hope it will continue the same way, because for the next year, 2025, we do have quite a number of available EB-5 visas. Per estimations, I took them from Invest in USA. Thank you. So there are going to be almost 7,000 of available visas for reserved EB-5 categories and 11,000 for unreserved. So hopefully they're going
Yeah.
to be all used.
That's the hope, and I think we're in kind of a golden age for the next 2 years. Really, for reserved, for unreserved, sorry, we're finally going to see movement on numbers that hadn't changed for 5, 6, 7 years. Reserved is going to be interesting and complicated, but I do see it kind of moving forward in the right direction. It's just a matter of how quickly and how bad will these backlogs be for the two biggest filers. For people who are not from China and India, this is heaven, right? You're seeing adjudications get faster. You're seeing the program actually work. You're seeing more possibilities on the market. You're seeing more options. EB-5 has never been better, really, for a lot of those folks. Yes, it's more expensive than it's ever been, but it's also it's coming with a lot of benefits, and seeing some of these processing times and the trend, we're trending towards a faster processing time to get your green card after investment. That should be the most encouraging thing for, I think, most investors around the world who are not from India and China.
And the last slide for today. So the huge change which happened in US last year, it's a new president. And what do you think would his election mean for the EB-5?
Yeah, it's anyone's guess, I suppose. But based on what he did last time, he did really kind of crack down on immigration overall. Everything became a little bit more strict in terms of adjudication standards and things like that. And it did often lead to a lot more RFEs and delays and things like that. But he didn't change the nature of the rules. And I do think that EB-5 has undergone a lot of reform during that time period. And so we've seen a lot more. We've just seen everyone kind of move forward in terms of how they're expecting to see applications, what kind of documents you need to provide. The RIA also included some more guidance on this. For example, now you have to include a certain number of years of tax returns with each filing and things like that. So I don't think he's going to change much for EB-5. I think what he's going to target is going to be illegal immigration and some of these other categories that take jobs away from U.S. workers, like H-1B and L-1, which isn't necessarily the case, but that's open to interpretation. And I think that we might see a slight slowdown, at least at first, in adjudication of like adjustment of status. But remember that EB-5 is done at the IPO, the Immigrant Investor Program Office. It's its own kind of shop. It's its own entity. And EB-5 gets support from both sides of the aisle. And we talked about this when Trump was in office last time. He's a developer. US developers are the ones who benefit the most from the EB-5 program. I don't see it going away. I don't see it kind of changing until 2027, when the program is supposed to be basically renewed. But yeah, I think his focus is really going to be on some of the more fringe areas of immigration, more so than this big category that brings a lot of investment and jobs to the US.
And hoping that nothing dramatic would change in the following 1-2 years, but we're anyway going to have changes in 2027. And these changes would be related to the term of EB-5 Regional Center program, because there are two direct EB-5 and regional center program which have to be extended into 2027, and the amount of investment may change as well, because when you talk with investors, they sometimes saying, okay, the amount had changed so many times in the last few years, if it's going to change next year. So what are your thoughts on the increase of amount and extension of the program in 2027?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's written into the law that it's going to change and the amount is going to go up. I think, my guess is that we're probably going to see some kind of clarity on this sustainment period issue. Finally, it'll get written into the next renewal. That would be the hope. That would be the best case scenario. Obviously, the amount is going to go up based on at least the inflation level. Unfortunately, inflation's been kind of high, so it might be, maybe a $50,000 jump or something like that. But I do think that, there's a possibility that it could be even a little bit higher for the investment amount to go up. So let's see. This is always kind of the panic mode and a little bit of stress when it comes to EB-5, is when the program is up for reauthorization. There's starting to be some talk about, a permanent reauthorization. I'm not so sure about that. That would be super nice. We can all cross our fingers and hope for that, but that I think that would be a little bit less likely. we're definitely going to see some kind of changes, obviously, in the next iteration, whether it's investment amount, maybe the set aside categories will have different sizes or different ways that they're basically put together. We'll see. The hope for now is that for sure we get reauthorization. It's a very small increase in the amount that people have to invest, and we get a little bit more clarity on some of the things that the RA fixed a lot of things, but also uncovered some new problems like the sustainment period issue, and hopefully we'll get some clarification on those. I think that's what we're all hoping for.
And a long-term extension, at least for 5 years, right?
That would be ideal. At least 5 years, if all goes well, hopefully better than that.
Yeah, so we are done. Thank you so much, Ahmed, for your time and lots of interesting insights on what were happening with EB-5 in 2024 and your thoughts on the future of the program. Thanks a lot.
Thanks for having me, Aurora. Always great to speak with you about the program and kind of recap how the year went, and hopefully we provide a lot of insight to investors who are already in the program or who are looking to possibly invest. So thank you so much for having me.
Thank you. And thanks to everyone who listened to the update till the end. And if you like it, don't forget to subscribe and like. Thank you. Bye.